NotSoErudite is a political commentator and live streamer who is popular for her defense of liberal ideas in opposition to Christian nationalism and social conservatism. Today, she'll be coming on to give an introduction to her political and religious outlook as a liberal and Christian. So how would you describe your general worldview to someone unfamiliar?
I don't know. The problem with labels is they're never going to capture anyone perfectly. I'm liberal, who's soft populist in a couple of ways, but still a staunch institutionalist in a lot of other ways. Christian, radical in all the right places, I guess. A liberal who's radical in all the right places. How about that?
I think right now in the United States, liberalism is associated with the defense of certain political institutions. How would you define liberalism?
I mean, the way that I would define liberalism for me is it's a state that's interested in strong institutions, a welfare state, protections of the rights and liberties of individuals, and providing the greatest access of equal opportunity to its citizens. That's what I think like a liberal state is and what it should be doing. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think it does. And it seems like a significant divide between establishment Democrats and those farther to the left is how to deal with Trump and more radical or populist right-wing tendencies. How would you approach these concerns?
Right-wing radicalism, I think, is respondent to the same things that left-wing radicalism is. I think like wealth disparity in a population tends to lead to high levels of dissatisfaction. And then the direction of blame that the populist movement puts for their dissatisfaction is oftentimes less meaningful to me than going, oh, okay, people are increasingly dissatisfied. We almost always see massive amounts of dissatisfaction when there is great levels of wealth disparity within a single society. And so we should pay attention to that disparity. I think did you watch Louis Theroux's latest Inside the Red Pill documentary that he released?
I have not. I've heard things.
It's good. It's a classic Louis Theroux. I love all of his documentaries. But he talks to a couple of the consumers of Justin Waller and a couple of these other big red pill guys. And what you see consistently is pain. I mean, one of the guys that he talked to, he'd been homeless. His brother had died by suicide recently. And you see like a lot of anger and suffering and it not feeling and not feeling like there is an answer that satisfies them, and particularly in an intersectional way as men, because I think a lot of men feel like there's nobody building a script and structure for them. So I think right-wing radicalism has mostly responded to the wealth disparity that is causing particularly young, poor people to be increasingly left behind. And the right side has really tapped into the intersection of men, particularly, that's pulling men towards the right and radicalizing them. But I think fundamentally it's a lot of times based around wealth disparity and parts of our welfare state being insufficient.
Another divide between establishment and anti-establishment people is Israel. This divide seems to be uniquely cross-party in that you can find people on both sides of the issue, both on the left and right of the political spectrum. How would you navigate this?
Yeah, I think one of the issues is that like the way Israel has extended their war with Gaza is like pretty intolerable, right? I think that's just like a really difficult thing. And then when people go, well, why are we still in such close relationship with them? And it's like, we need to talk about the last 80 years of history between the two countries. And the reason why these two countries are so linked is for really, really good reasons, actually, right? Particularly if you look at the history of the Cold War and whether you think the Cold War is good or not, what you fundamentally have is a battle of communism versus democracy. And in the case of Israel, it is the staging grounds for that proxy war, even though I disagree with proxy wars. And so our relationship with Israel is very understandable. And that doesn't mean that it's a sign off on Bibi Netanyahu's extended war, particularly because if you look at Bibi Netanyahu, we have to be realistic about the fact that we've got somebody who's been in power for almost 17 years in a democracy and is utilizing essentially the status quo of mild state of war to retain his hold on his coalition government and making deals with the further right to maintain it. And so it's tough though, because this also gets blended with this like constant issue of anti-Semitism that just is a problem, and it is connected to this, right? Like when I hear people talk about AIPAC, for example, I don't like AIPAC, but I don't like AIPAC for the same reason that I don't like any super PAC, particularly a super PAC with specific vested interests, which by the way is almost all of them, right? I saw a short the other day that said 93 out of 100 senators receive AIPAC money. Okay, well, I believe it is 45 senators all receive money from the United Beer Institution, right? AIPAC isn't even the largest PAC. There's another PAC that actually funds 97 of all senators. I can't remember which one it is. But like the problem is the PACs, not necessarily Israel in and of itself. And so there's like this weird anti-Semitic piece that really like gets ramped up where everyone feels really comfortable just blaming the Jews, that has some sort of weird historical consistency of everyone wanting to blame the Jews all the time, that's attached as well to a legitimate criticism of a government utilizing a horrific war to maintain status quo control of his democracy, right? So it's this very messy thing that's been propagandized a lot, and the way to go about sorting out how to think about it is so complicated that I think a simple narrative works better. And unfortunately, Israel is doing more awful things to Gaza than Gazans are doing to Israel, even though in reality, if Gazans had the power, they would be doing probably infinitely worse things to Israelis because they've said as much. But it doesn't matter because that's not what's happening. So it's a tough one to solve.
A similarly intense debate, which seems to have grown more fiery in the last 10 years, is the divide between men's groups and feminists. It seems like there's been an increasing amount of vitriol between men and women, and this is something you seem to talk about quite a bit online. How would you approach this issue?
I mean, I think the divide somewhat always existed. It's just exacerbated right now, right? And so how do we mend the divide? I think the answers are there. The issue is the right has no interest in mending the divide at all. So it's going to be a single side pulling all of the weight to bridge people together, which unfortunately looks like a partisan attempt to pull people for votes. And for a lot of people, it is a partisan attempt to pull votes. So I don't know. It's this really, how do you get the left to care about men while not making women who feel like their rights are significantly more under attack? And I would argue that they are in America, not making women feel neglected or disregarded, but also recognizing that young men are just uniquely struggling in a unique way, and the left isn't offering any off-ramps for them in the way that they'll take it, right? I think the left has a lot of answers for young men that the left would say, you know, this is what you should do. And it's like, it's not even appealing to young men, so they don't really want to take it. Most people on the left don't really want to meet young men where they are, because where young men are is a really kind of awful place. Like there just is rampant sexism and homophobia and all these isms that are there. And so nobody wants to meet them where they are because it feels like it's a yes man to the bigoted behavior. And so I don't know. I don't know the solution, and the right has no intention of solving it. So it's a one-sided issue to solve.
It seems like despite an increase in general political interest, politics has become more unserious now than it was in the past. Politicians now frequently employ memes or intentional mockery. Figures like Gavin Newsom have begun to intentionally mirror the controversial rhetoric of Trump as retaliation. Is this something you believe your allies should embrace, or is it best avoided?
It's the great Mullick's game question. If you don't participate in some level of the like behavior that we think is negative and bad, then you just can't participate in the game at all. So you have no say on the game. But if you participate in the negative behavior, how do you make sure that you're the one being the most ethical about it, right? And every single person thinks that they're being the most ethical about this game. So it's this terrifying Mullick's game that I think has to be participated in, right? I think that if we just continue to maintain no media literacy with alt media, the left will continue to be left behind. But part of sophistication on alt media spaces is unfortunately a simplification and kind of memification of reality, which is very tough because it's hard to take these political institutes seriously when they're memifying everything. But we're now even starting to see it. I think the Netherlands just released some Pixar meme movie of Trump in his brain in response to all the White House cringe posts of AI videos of video games and blowing up Iranian like ships. So I don't know. It's just, I don't know. I don't know the perfect answer here, but we definitely have to participate in it, because if we are unable to play the game at all, we will just be left behind. And I think you can see it with a lot of Democratic politicians who are like, I don't want to engage in that. It's so, not elite and not, the right way to be as a politician. It's like, cool. Who are you? Nobody knows. So I think there are good ways to play the media game where you don't have to give up all of the principled cards. Time will only tell. Like Gavin Newsom, is he giving up his principled cards? Hard to know. We don't really know what his presidential policies are going to be. So we have no idea at all. We've seen him kind of talk about some culture war stuff, but we don't actually know what principles Gavin Newsom might bring into a presidential run, which I think is a really big question, despite the fact that his media campaign has been massively successful. It has just been leading the way, and it's been one of the only spaces that has been able to engage in alt media, other than James Tallarico, I would argue, and Zoran Mamdani to some extent, these are like the only three on the left side that have been running really successful media campaigns, but each of them look a little bit different. And they strike this question of, it's not obvious that you just have to run it like Gavin Newsom, because James Talarico's campaign is nothing like Gavin Newsom, but he is playing the debate game and the clip game and whatnot. So I think an assumption that we have to get as dirty as Trump is probably not true, but we do have to be able to think about how to engage in alt media and play the game well, or we will never, ever we'll never win elections.
Speaking of electoral politics, what strategies would you like to see employed by the Republicans and Democrats in the 2026 and 2028 elections? What candidates would you select if given the choice?
Sure. Yeah. So this is where I probably differ than a lot of certain liberals. So a lot of liberals feel like we need to like solidify our base with the left more and build coalitions with like leftists. I disagree. I think that we have to reach moderates. And I think Gavin Newsom's campaign, for example, has been, at least at a media level, been attempting to do that. But even some of his rhetoric and how he's speaking about different things, he's definitely abandoning the more strict, much further left California rhetoric and moving towards more moderate rhetoric. A lot of people will criticize my position and say, we have to reach the moderates. Like, haven't we been doing that forever? What do you think Liz Cheney was? Liz Cheney was like 6 months of attempt. And no, we haven't been trying to reach moderates from like 2016 to 2022. Our goal was not reaching moderates. It was shifting the culture to be more left, like us, and pulling people in that way, which I'm not even saying if that's necessarily a good or bad thing. All I'm saying is that then we lost the culture war. A lot of people really did get sick of us, a lot of like normie people. And it is important to reach the moderate because the moderate voter is going to swing the elections. And liberals need these votes. They desperately do. Liberals, the tent is as big as we can make it, but we need to be aware of our like core central principles of liberalism, right? So if we make a tent that includes genuine communists or socialists, I'm willing to ally with anyone on anything, especially in the face of Trump, right? If a communist wants to ally on some campaign of canvassing or something like that to get a Democrat elected against a Republican in the space of Trump, I'm for that, obviously. Even in the future, if we have a Democrat politician and a communist group wants to ally with me to try to get votes to pressure our Democrat moderate politician, for example, to get in behind some sort of bill that is more aggressive on things like access to healthcare or access to food or something like that, I'll work in allyship with almost anyone that I'm goal aligned with. The problem I think that the left has is that we, in 2016 to 2022, all the moderate Democrats pretended that we were the same as the leftists. And we were like, yeah, we're just like you. And it's like, no, we're not. And leftists know this and they're burnt on liberals because they were like, you guys keep pretending to be like us and you're not like us, right? One of the foundations that we need to ask people is, do you want to vote away private property rights? If you do, I disagree with you. That's fine, I'll ally with you. But we're not in the same tent. We're not in the same tent, and we shouldn't pretend that is the case. And we should also recognize that the moderate voter isn't going to like that. They will never be on the side of getting rid of private property rights. And I'm not wanting to get into a big discussion of like whether that's a good or bad policy. I'm obviously liberal. I obviously disagree with that. But I think we did this dangerous thing where we pretended like communists and socialists who are more in that communist direction, anyone essentially who would say, yes, I do want the removal of private property rights, or yes, I want the state mandated democratization of the workplace, that's fine. You're not in our tent. We can work together on things, but we're not in the same tent. And I think a really big issue that Democrats did is we pretended like we were in these people's tent. And then when they started saying way more crazy shit, it came back on us, understandably, because we've been saying the whole time that we're just like them. And so the Republicans are like, you're just like them. You just said you're these progressives. And we're like, well, yeah, but we're like not like that. And it's like, and then the progressives are like, what the fuck? Thought you were just like us, right? So I think we have to be really clear about what the principles of a liberal means or what a Democrat is standing for, and be really clear about that. And then when we ally with libertarians or when we ally with communists, being really clear that it's an allyship, it is not a big tent. We're not the same.
We've discussed your responses to some of the divides between liberals and the left, but why do you side with liberalism over leftism?
I think private property is an essential right, and I think tyranny emerges very quickly when private property is reduced.
Well, that's a simple, understandable answer. So
yeah, that's a big one for me. Yeah, it's like a human right, basically. Not a human right, but a citizen right. I would never want to remove a citizen right in that way.
So shifting slightly to the religious realm, you've identified yourself as a Christian, a Orthodox Protestant. Mm-hmm. How would you
Radical
describe your
Orthodox.
beliefs? Radical Orthodox Protestant.
Yeah, get
How
it
would you
right.
describe-
Get my esoteric label right. How dare you?
How would you describe your belief? And how would you contrast it with evangelicalism in the United States?
Sure. So unlike, do you know what the solas are? Probably, I should just explain them.
Sola
even if you do.
Scriptura, sola
Yeah,
fide.
yeah. Sola fide. So most radical Orthodox Protestants, their theology is going to be a lot more like closer to Catholics in that we're not sola scriptura, right? We're not just going to only treat the Bible as the only thing that you can take wisdom from and recognize. For example, most Catholics and most radical Orthodox Protestants will say, yeah, of course the Bible is full of errors, human errors. Like, of course, right? Did Jesus say it? Well, hard to know. The original transcriptions are pretty bad, right? But another thing that's really big for radical orthodoxy is it's very anti like biblical deconstructionism. So what I mean by that is I'm not going to find a single verse and use that to justify an entire claim, right? So a lot of like anti-abortion Christians will pull out like Jeremiah, where it's like, I know the plans I have for you. You know, he's known you before you like open your first eyes. And they'll be like, see, that proves that life begins at conception. And it's like, first of all, literally doesn't at all. It just says that he's known you for all of eternity, right? Like it's just crazy. It's like if your mom refuses to let your dad nut in you, is she also aborting you because he like had originally planned me and then you like, I don't know, it's just crazy. So we're not going to engage in biblical deconstruction, right? If you want to ask me, what does God say about X? I'm going to look at all of the verses that talk about it, the chapters that verse is within, try to look at the writer and who it's to, right? In the case of Paul writing letters to the Corinthians, right? I'm going to look at who's Paul, why is he writing the Corinthians, why in this way, what was going on in the Corinth church that he needed to write about these specific topics, right? What are the words that he chose to use? What are the words that he did not choose to use? And to what degree do we even know that he chose these specific words, right? And then from all of this is like exegesis. Then we'll look at this and go, what is the emergent principle that we feel like is resonating from not just scripture in like the Bible, but also like scriptures and great thinkers around it. So it's a lot more about trying to engage in the Bible in the way that it was genuinely originally written, with a lot more like Eastern tradition into thinking about mythology and history, and trying to use exegesis specifically to figure out what the principles are that Christ values and how to apply those principles in a modern world. Simple.
You mentioned your pro-choice position. Abortion in particular is seen as quite controversial among Christians, and you've mentioned some of the verses given as reasons. But if you believe Christians are picking out scripture to suit their ends, why do you believe they're motivated to do so? Why is Christianity so connected with conservatism in the first place?
I think there's been a huge politicization, especially of the Protestant church. I think in general, conservatives, when it comes to these like hard to know, somewhat philosophical questions, err on the more conservative side, right? We don't know when ensoulment begins, which is what actually matters. It's the thing that we care about when we say killing a person. It's an ensouled person, right? So God put a little soul in there. The issue is, okay, how do you know what that is, and how do you prove that something is ensouled, right? You can't, it's metaphysical. The more theological sound argument for being life beginning at conception is it's the most conservative estimate, because it certainly is probably kind of beginning there. So it's probably the earliest point at which ensoulment can begin, right? My argument against this would basically go, that's crazy, because even in the Bible, we see God giving law in Exodus where he carves out that if you assault a woman or you injure a woman who's pregnant and you cause a miscarriage, that as long as the child was unformed, you only receive a financial fine, right? If God thought that was a person, a human soul, why wouldn't it be like they had capital punishment? In fact, if the abortion that occurs, right, the miscarriage that occurs is to what they call a formed life, you will get the capital punishment. So like, why does God delineate this in Exodus 21, but we all pretend that it's simple, right? And so the standard Christian policy is like, keep it simple, we have no idea. I think that is understandable and uninformed based on Exodus. And I think that nobody who's a Christian has given me a satisfactory answer for Exodus at all. And it suggests to me this question of God seems to recognize that we value unformed lives differently. How should we go about bringing about the greatest glorification to God, right? It seems like God wants to see flourishing, people being well, families being united, connection, love, right? Choice, okay, well, it seems like God made this carve out of acknowledging that unformed fetuses, we're not morally treating the same as a formed fetus or a born child because it's in Exodus. There's only one conclusion to me from this. Like there really is only one conclusion, which is going, there's some point where ensoulment begins where we should definitely care. And even then we might still have this conversation of when does the moral balance out in such a way that like best flourishing happens? Because we see in cases where it's fully criminalized, like in states where basically abortion is not accessible. We see mothers die more often, infants die more often, child poverty increases, child foster care increases, like all of these negative effects occur. This doesn't mean that I just want wanton killing your baby at 8 months of gestation, but nobody wants this on the pro-life side. So it's a blend of Exodus and then a recognition that policy isn't necessarily going to be the same thing as moral choice.
I think the other biggest clash between Christianity and liberalism, as traditionally understood, would be sexual freedom, both in terms of the necessity of traditional gender roles and sexual orientation. What's your perspective as a Christian and liberal?
So I guess I should probably answer this, even for the abortion. As a Christian, when it comes to something that could be a sin, and I think it's hard to know in a modern landscape, like I think abortion is hard to know. I think there are reasonable answers as to why it might begin at conception. I think there are reasonable answers as to why it doesn't. Regardless, what I would tell a Christian is you should pray about it. You should pray about it because we have to believe that if you come to God earnestly and genuinely seeking wisdom, that he'll give it to you, right? God's not going to be like, it's not a sin. And then suddenly you get to the gates of heaven and he's like, psych, idiot, fucking got you. Like, I'm assuming that God isn't a trickster, right? So at a personal level, I would say you should pray to God about it, right? I've thought a fair bit about gay stuff. I think that there are pretty good theological arguments as to why it could be a sin. I think there are also pretty good theological arguments as to why it might not be a sin. But I think one of the issues is when people are like, well, how do you think about it? Well, I'm not gay, frankly. So like it's not the sin that I have to wrestle with. There are other sins that I have to spend a lot of time in though. For example, not that any Christian wants to talk about this, pride, okay? Pride is an area, if you look at like how Augustine talks about it, pride is both over-assuming yourself or under-assuming yourself, right? And I struggle a lot with shame, which is technically sin, right? So like when I'm thinking about sin, I'm spending a lot more time, at least personally, in prayer and thinking about the sins that like might be relevant to my life. So to the queer person who's trying to decide if God can love them or not, I think you should ask God, and I think you should spend time in the Word and look at both the theological arguments for and against it, and pray that God gives you an answer, regardless of what that looks like. At a political level, I would never bar anyone from having any sort of like, I'm not interested in my state enacting rules of my self-prescribed church. So at a political level, do whatever you want. I don't care. Not my business. Don't harm people.
Shifting from critiques from Christianity of progressivism and toward a critique from progressivism of Christianity, many leftists and liberals, including feminists, would say that Christianity as a religion has been employed to oppress throughout its history, and therefore should be distrusted as an institution. How would you respond to this accusation?
Well, when communists say that, I would basically be like, aren't you in the same boat? Right? Like the reality is that you can believe in an ideology and acknowledge all the flaws in it, right? And so like for the communists, the reason I'm not a communist isn't because I think communism is necessarily evil. I think it leads to the worst outcomes, right? I think it leads to the worst outcomes, but I think there's really good communist critiques of capitalism, major flaws that it points out in capitalism. In the state of Christianity, okay, I don't think Christianity or feminism or any of these things is just all of its specific acts. I think that conservatives love this. Feminism in its original nascence with the suffragettes was also very racist. I don't think feminism is inherently racist, but I definitely am not proud of certain parts of feminist history that is racist. I think that that's a bad part of it. And I basically would look at it and say, when you look at like all of the history of the church, oftentimes when the church is the most progressive, when it's pushing science, when it's pushing the exchange of ideas, when it's the most interested in the common man, we see the church leading things. We see some of the best thinkers coming out of the church. We see science coming out of the church. And when the church gets captured by a political conservatism, I think it harms the church and it makes the church a terrible weapon, right? But I would not say that the history of any single ideological movement is proof of concept itself, right? It's a bit of a straw man to say communism's bad because all communist states have been bad. I think liberals like to use that one, but I actually think it's a bad one. I think a better argument against communism is it seems as though the removal of private property from the individual creates a situation and a system in which tyranny flourishes more often, which is is why it's failed. But it doesn't mean it necessarily has to fail, which is why if somebody came up with a communism that solved that issue, right, and protected people while removing private property, I might be open to it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. I think Christianity has faced a marked decline in the number of adherents, especially in Western countries like the United States. Do you think that there's hope for a revival of Christianity? And if so, what do you think it could provide to America as a country?
I think there is a hope. The question is the revival going to be good? Obviously, I'm Christian, right? So I to some degree, I'm saying, yeah, I believe in some metaphysical claim to magic. Magic that I think science can eventually prove and find, right, for the most part. But I think a revival for the faith is necessarily going to happen. And obviously, as a Christian, I would say, I think religions universally emerge over and over because there's something in us that is looking for something greater. And I do think that it is an orientation and some piece of evidence towards the supernatural or faith. And an atheist would disagree with me on that. That's totally fine. I don't think religion ever goes away. I think we will always have religion. It will always come in boom and bust cycles. We'll have more religion and less religion, and it'll look different, but I'm not convinced that it'll go away ever. I think what we actually have to be concerned about is, what does the revival look like? Billy Graham was one of the latest historical Protestant revolutions and revival movements that happened through the 40s to 60s. Okay, it was awful. It's what most North American churches are like, and it's an extremely politicized Protestantism that's fundamentalist in its approach to the book, right? Which is very crushing. Fundamentalism typically is not good for anyone. So the real question is, what is the revival going to look like? Obviously, I hope the revival is something that's more oriented towards the nature of Christ, his desire for people to have choice. Seems like agency and choice is one of the biggest things in the Bible. In fact, he allowed all of suffering and his son to die for choice. So I hope that we go in the direction of what I call liberalism, not as the political movement, but as choice. Agency. It's why I like liberalism in connection to Christianity. But it could go in the direction of fundamentalism, and that's really terrifying to think of. And I think it's why a lot of atheists need to be a little bit more mindful. I won't get into all of the philosophy, but if you've ever watched me debate the Wilson Eastern Orthodox bros, I'll always bring up Agrippa's trilemma, where I basically say all beliefs at a foundation are unjustifiable, right? Prove 1 = 1. You can't do it. Just like I can't prove to you God exists, right? That's another axiom that I have. In the same way that the atheist would say infinity exists. Can't really prove it, right? It can't prove these things necessarily. You can't prove that 1 = 1. And so to the atheist who oftentimes looks at religious people and they're smug on their throne of rightness, I would say, you fail Agrippa's trilemma just as much as I do. You just have a preference for infinite regression and circularity, and I have a preference for dogmatism, right? And circularity. I don't know why we would stand on these moral grounds. And I think one of the biggest issues as to why we rarely see a left revival of a faith, a more left-leaning revival of the faith, is the way that atheists want to treat religious people, despite the fact that I understand, right? They're frustrated, and they have probably personally come out of or seen people that have come out of fundamentalist Christianity, right? And it's that doesn't mean that a spiritual revival has to look the same as what it was before. And don't assume that the fundamentalists have the ontological truth what the faith must look like. It doesn't, right? At all. You're just already giving half of the fight over to. And so, yeah, I would encourage atheists to also support and be alongside their more left-leaning Christians. Try not to make Christians feel like bad people. We joke in my server, there's always some Phil subjectivist debate bro, and now there's the Eastern Orthodox bro, but for a long time it was the subjectivist who would basically debate rape somebody until a point where they're I'm stupid and I can't believe in anything. And that's the beginning of somebody moving from a moral objectivist to a subjectivist. And now we're actually seeing the same with the Eastern Orthodox bros, where they'll debate rape somebody into being you're so stupid for believing in subjectivism. And it's no, you're not. All of this has some reasonable grounds with which you can conclude your conclusions. All of it does. Except for nihilism. No, fictionalism, I think, is the worst, right? But all of it is there are great minds behind these movements. They're not unreasonable. You just have one that you like more, and that is fine, and it could be right. But stop with the moral superiority. It's so icky. And for a lot of liberal Christians, they don't even want to tell their secular friends that they're Christian, because I've had people tell me, you're really smart, but now that I know that you're Christian, I just think you're a little bit dumb. And they say it in this smug, disgusting way where I'm just I don't want to be friends with you anymore. I don't want to be friends with you when you like essentially are saying you're slightly less of a person to me as a result of this. Like you're just kind of icky. It's just like, okay, fuck you then. Like I'm not interested in this. Yeah, it's so awful. The way atheists treat liberal Christians is really frustrating for me.
In the past, you've mentioned a reluctance to discuss your reasons for being Christian in the first place as a result of the personal nature of your belief. Why is this?
Yeah, I have a lot of people that like are like pretty obsessively negative towards me. And it's like, I don't need the most like personal and like delightful parts of my life like ripped apart publicly by people who are only bad faith. And unfortunately, in the case of faith, because I have a lot of liberal friends, sharing that, making myself vulnerable in that way to people publicly, particularly in the liberal space, I know is just setting myself up for so many of those people to look at me condescendingly. So I'm not super interested in doing it, frankly. But if you want to talk to me like privately and personally, I'm always happy to share.
Do you have anything you feel has been left unsaid?
I guess if people have questions, they can ask them. I don't know. Like my biggest thing with my own platform is just like trying to maintain a decently high level of epistemic humility. And so if people have questions for me, I really, really welcome questions as long as it also comes from a mutual place of epistemic humility. I feel like it's one of the biggest things kind of missing in more of our like intellectual spaces, despite the fact that I think if you're a big scientist type, if you love science and the scientific methodology, or if you're a philosophical type, it's like these spaces necessarily demand epistemic humility, and yet oftentimes, including myself, I'm guilty of this as well. I think we fail and try to utilize our sense of rightness as a weapon to bludgeon others because we have smarts over people in a way that other people maybe don't. And I think that is unhelpful. And I think it chases people away from things like philosophy or theology or science. So yeah, if you have an intellectual audience, then I encourage you to engage in epistemic humility, and I want to do my best to engage in epistemic humility.
So if people want to ask these questions to you or see your content in general, where can they find you?
NotSoErudite everywhere.
Thank you for coming on, and thank you for watching. If you want to see more interviews like this with people who hold a wide variety of perspectives, please subscribe and share with others who may be interested. My next upload is with a Baruch Spinoza scholar, Mary Peterson.